In order to install and run virtual hosts on a physical computer running VMware ESXi 5.1, there are a number of different ways you can do this. You could, for instance, use the vSphere client like I'm doing here, or you could use the vSphere web client version 5.1. Now for this video I'm going to be covering how to do this on the vSphere client, but I'm only going to be covering using ESXi as the operating system on these virtual hosts, because you configure different hypervisors in different ways. Now, unlike version 5.0, you don't have to make a change to the actual configuration file of the physical computer. It's now actually being decided by the virtual machine itself. So what you would do is you would create a new virtual machine. I'll go with custom. I'll give this computer a name, so let's call it North Host number 7. Point it to the storage drive. Now, even though ESXi 5.1 supports hardware version 9, I can't actually select that during the initial creation process, but I can change it after the virtual machine's been created. For the operating system, I'll go with Other, and then Other 64-bit, but I will change this afterwards. I need at least 2 CPUs and at least 2 gig of memory for ESXi. I'll put the network card into the trunk port group, and although I can actually select up to 4 at this stage and add more of them afterwards, this is just a demo, so I'll just leave it at 1. For the adapter, I'll go with E1000, because what I found is that if I'm running ESXi 5.1 on the physical computer, there have been times where I've used either of these VMX-net adapters, and I've installed ESXi 4.1, for instance, as the operating system on this virtual machine, and it's just crashed with a trace error. When I used version 5.0, it halted, complaining there was no network adapter, and yet when I rebooted the physical computer and tried it again, it actually worked. So I'd rather avoid, these what could be intermittent bugs. But another reason I do that is, as I mentioned, I'm going to be changing the guest operating system after this virtual machine's been created. And when I do that, these are the only options I've got. So if later down the line I decide to add more network cards to this virtual machine, I'd rather keep them all the same. For the disk provisioning, I'll go with thin provisioning since it's a lab. And then just before I create that virtual machine, I'll make some last minute changes. So I'll delete the floppy disk drive, and I'll point the CD drive over to the ISO file. In this case 5.0, and tick connected power on. Once the actual virtual machine itself is created, I've got to go back and change the actual guest operating system. So when I select the drop down menu, I've now got 2 additional options which weren't there during the initial creation process. So obviously if I was going to install 5.x as the operating system, I would go with this one. If I was going to go with if I was going to install 4.x, I would go with this one. Now what I found is that if you install 5.x onto this virtual machine, it doesn't mind if you leave the actual operating system as other 64-bit, but if you install 4.x, it will. The installation process will work, but I actually run into problems where I can't power on new virtual machines, or I can't migrate virtual machines to it. So if it's a 4.x host, then I'll always have to pick that. So for consistency, I'll just select this 5.x guest operating system for this particular virtual machine, which will be running ESXi 5.0. And just to show you that once I've changed that guest operating system, if I add a new network adapter to it, I can only pick either E1000 or E1000E. Now once I've changed the guest operating system, I need to actually update the VMX file to enable this, the actual virtualized hardware virtualization feature. So one way to do that is to browse the data store, go to the folder for that machine. Then what I do is I'll rename the file, and then I'll download this file to my computer so that I can edit it. So I'll go over to the folder and I'll rename this back to a VMX file. If I open it with Notepad, it's not really useful really. Put word wrap on doesn't make any difference. So I just use WordPad to actually to edit these. Now the change that I need to make is I need to add this extra line to the VMX file. And this one is to, it says phv.enable equals true, which this is what enables the virtualized hardware virtualization feature on this virtual machine. So I'll copy that across. I'll save the change. And incidentally, if I want, I could change the virtual hardware version here. I mean, I've just got to change that to 9, for instance, or I could right click on the actual virtual machine. I've got an option here to upgrade virtual hardware as well. But it works perfectly fine if you leave it on version 8. So once I've made that change, what I've got to do is I've got to go over to the data store, and the features here are all grayed out. So I'll just jump folders here, and I'll that enables the features again. I'll upload this particular VMX file back to the host. So now that change has been made, the feature's been enabled, and the guest operating system has been set correctly, I could actually power this up and then start the installation process for the hypervisor, and then I'll be able to use this as a virtual host. Now, just to demonstrate some of the actual problems that you can run into, this host here, it's got 4.1 installed on it, and the guest operating system is set to 4.x. This host is the same, 4.1 installed, operating system 4.x. This one, host number 3, on the other hand, although I've set the guest operating system to 4.x, I didn't edit the VMX file, which means that the virtualized hardware virtualization feature isn't enabled. Host number 4 is running 5.0. I've also enabled the virtual hardware virtualization feature on this virtual host, and I've set its guest operating system to 5.x. So what I'll find is these hosts work perfectly fine, but this one doesn't. So I'll jump over to vCenter here. So you can see I've got some virtual machines here which are running on these 2 hosts here. If I right click on that server there and I try to migrate it over to from host 1 to host 2, it's saying validation succeeded. If I try to send it to host 4, it's saying validation succeeded. If I try to send it to host 3 though, it's complaining about the hardware virtualization not working. And again, that's because I haven't actually enabled the feature. I didn't edit the VMX file and add that extra feature to enable it. And also, as you see, the boxes, the next button here is actually grayed out, so I can't actually do anything at all. I would have to power this off, edit the VMX file to fix it, and then power it back up again. But in the meantime, anyway, I'll just tell it to migrate over to the version 5 host. If I go back to these other hosts that I've got host number 5. This one's, it's got ESXi 5.0 installed. I've changed the guest operating system to 5.x, but what I did on this one is I didn't enable this feature in the VMX file. And if we go over to the actual console window here, what's happened is it's got so far through the installation process, and it's now started to complain about hardware virtualization not being supported. So like on a physical server, for instance, which has got an Intel processor, it could be an issue like the processor doesn't support extended paging tables, or it doesn't have the features enabled within the BIOS. But in this case, it's because the actual VMX file hasn't had this extra line added in to enable the feature. So unlike version 4, which installed OK, version 5 actually runs into a problem straight away when you try to install it. For this particular host here, I've installed 4.1 on it. I have enabled a feature, so I've added this to the VMX file, But what I didn't do is I didn't change the guest operating system. So if I jump over to the back to vCenter, you can see that this particular machine is now being migrated. So if I pick, say, server 1, let's say I try to actually migrate this one. So we'll try to send it to number 1. That says succeeded. Try to send it into number 3. Nope, doesn't like that. Try to send it to number 4. And that's okay. Now if I try to send it to number 6, it doesn't actually complain initially. But if I actually then try to migrate it, what you'll find is it only gets as far as 14%. And eventually what will happen is this this migration process it'll eventually time out. Now, and some of the other issues that I've actually run into is if we go back to host number 3, this particular one, although it's got the guest operating system set correctly, I didn't enable the feature. So I've created a virtual machine and it's ready to be powered on for the first time to install the operating system. But if I try that, it generates an error message to do with the hardware virtualization. So it's the same issue it had when I tried to actually migrate a virtual machine to it. Host number 6, on the other hand, if we go back to that one, it does have the actual virtual hardware virtualization feature enabled, but the guest operating system has been left as other 64-bit. So if I go back to vCenter, if I try to power this one on, I get a different error message where it's complaining and it won't power on. It's saying that the outer virtual machine needs to be reconfigured in order to be able to do that. Now in the meantime, server 1, as you can see, it's still stuck there. But it will actually eventually time out, and I'll get the same issue as trying to power this one up. It'll throw me an error message complaining that it timed out due to not being able to power up on that particular host. So if you do actually want to create virtual hosts on a physical computer which is running ESXi 5.1, and you want those running ESXi as the operating system, what you would do is you could create a virtual machine within the vSphere client, set the guest operating system to other 64-bit to begin with. Then once you've created the machine, you would change that to either ESXi 4.x for a 4.x operating system running on the virtual machine, or ESXi 5.x if you're going to be running a 5.x operating system. You've also got to then edit the VMX file to actually enable the feature, the virtualized hardware virtualization feature on the virtual machine itself. Because if you don't, you'll run into error messages. So as you can see here, this is that error message I mentioned to do with server 1. It's thrown up this error message saying that the operation is timed out due to a power on issue. So just to see, I mean, server 1, it was originally stuck at 14%, and that's that error message.